I drove 4 hours from Sudbury to Toronto in a snowstorm to watch my only son introduce me to the family of the woman he was going to marry. That was the plan anyway. What actually happened was that I pulled into the parking garage beneath the Hazelton Hotel in Yorkville, took the elevator to the lobby, and handed my coat to a young woman at the door who smiled at me with the practiced warmth of someone paid to smile. She checked a list on an iPad. She checked it again. She asked my name a second time with an expression that had stopped being warm. Then she excused herself, walked to the far end of the lobby, and returned with a man in a fitted black suit who introduced himself as the event coordinator. "Sir," he said quietly, leaning in so the other guests behind me wouldn't hear, "I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the confirmed guest list. We have instructions from the host that the final count is firm." I looked at him for a long moment. The host, my son. The boy I taught to skate on the frozen pond behind our property in Muskoka. I stood there in my good dress shirt, the one I'd ironed that morning, and I nodded. "I understand," I said. I walked back to the elevator. I rode it down to the parking garage. I sat in my truck, a 2009 F-150 that still ran perfectly because I maintained it myself, and I made a phone call. Not to my son, not to argue, not to beg, not to make a scene in a hotel lobby that I happened to own 40% of. I called my accountant, a man named David who had managed the Carter Holdings Trust for 22 years and who had been expecting this call since the moment I told him about the dinner 3 weeks ago. "David," I said, "I want to activate the clause." He didn't ask which clause. He already knew. The dinner was still in progress. My son was upstairs with his fiancée and her family, eating food I had paid for in a private dining room I partially own, in a neighborhood where I held 4 commercial properties and 1 residential building that generated enough passive income every month to make that hotel look modest. They thought I was a retired electrician living off a government pension. They thought I drove to Toronto on weekends to watch Leafs games and shop at Canadian Tire. They thought I was, in the precise words my son's fiancée had used the previous Thanksgiving, a little out of his depth. I took out a small notebook from the glove compartment and wrote down the time. It was 7:43 in the evening, on the first Saturday of February. I started the engine to keep warm. Outside, the snow was falling steadily the way it does in Toronto in February, unhurried and relentless, covering everything in a layer of white that made the city look, briefly, as though it had never made a single mistake. I gave it until 8 o'clock. Let me go back 6 months. Because the dinner didn't happen in a vacuum. My son is 34 years old, and he's a good man underneath all of it. I want to be clear about that. He spent his 20s working hard, got himself a job in commercial real estate, was honest and straightforward in the way I'd tried to raise him to be. His mother passed when he was 19, and the two of us managed together the way men do, not talking about the grief but being present for each other through it. He came up to Sudbury every Christmas. He called every Sunday evening. He was, for a long time, the thing I was most proud of in my life. Then he met her. She came from a family in Forest Hill, the old money neighborhood in Midtown Toronto, where the houses have circular driveways and the children grow up assuming the world is arranged for their comfort. Her father was, according to my son, a prominent investor. Her mother sat on the boards of 2 charitable foundations. They wintered in the Cayman Islands and summered in Prince Edward Island. My son told me all of this with a reverence that I recognized immediately. It was the reverence of a man who had decided, somewhere deep in his chest, that the world he came from wasn't good enough anymore. The first time I met her was at a dinner at my son's condo in Liberty Village. She arrived 40 minutes late, looked around his apartment with a smile that was doing a great deal of work to conceal something, and said that she loved what he'd done with the space in a tone that made clear she didn't. She shook my hand once, briefly, and spent the rest of the evening angled slightly away from me at the table, directing her conversation at my son as though I were a piece of furniture that had been mistakenly left in the room. She called me by my first name the entire evening, though I hadn't offered it. She called my son by a shortened version of his name that none of his friends used. Small things. But I've spent 40 years in skilled trades reading blueprints, and I know how to look at a structure and understand which parts are decorative and which parts are load-bearing. What she was showing me that evening was entirely decorative. After dinner, while my son walked her down to get a cab, I stood at the window and looked out at the lake. When he came back up, he was already apologetic in that preemptive way that means someone has been coached. "She's a lot when you first meet her," he said. I nodded. "She grew up very differently than we did," he said. "I know," I said. "She just wants things to be a certain way," he said. "For our life together, she has a vision." I looked at my son. He was using language that wasn't his. A vision. He'd never used that word in his life. He was a man who fixed problems with his hands and said what he meant directly. And now he was using words that had been placed in his mouth. I asked him if he was happy. He said of course he was, but he said it half a second too fast. Over the following months, the distance widened in the way these things do, quietly and then suddenly. The Sunday phone calls became shorter, then less frequent. When I drove down to Toronto in October to see a Leafs game, something we'd done together every fall since he was 12, he canceled the morning of, citing a prior commitment he hadn't mentioned before. When I asked if I should come to Christmas, there was a pause before he said yes, and the pause told me everything. Christmas was fine on the surface, but fine is a word that covers a lot of cold ground. She made remarks about Sudbury over dinner that she framed as jokes. She asked me, twice, whether I'd considered downsizing my property. She suggested, once, that my son was held back by family obligations that other men his age had already moved past. She said it while looking at the television, as though she were simply observing something obvious. My son said nothing. I drove home on December 26th in the dark, 4 hours up Highway 400 through the Shield, and I thought about the house I'd built myself on 11 acres outside of town, the house where my son grew up, the house where his mother had planted a garden along the south wall that still came up every spring, 30 years later, without anyone tending it. I thought about what it means to build something from raw materials with your own hands, and what it means to have someone stand in the middle of it and call it a limitation. 2 weeks later, my son called to tell me he'd proposed. She'd said yes. There would be a dinner in February to introduce both families formally at a restaurant in Yorkville. He'd take care of the arrangements. I congratulated him. I asked if I could help with anything. He hesitated. "Actually, Dad," he said, "her family they're used to a certain type of event. I just want everything to go smoothly. Maybe just let me handle the details." I said I understood, and I did. I understood more than he knew. What I hadn't told my son, and what I had not told anyone outside of David and my lawyer, was that 15 years earlier I had made a series of real estate investments in the Toronto market that had compounded into something that would have surprised even people who knew me well. It started with one duplex in Leslieville, bought in 2003 with money I'd saved over 20 years of electrical contracting and a small inheritance from my own father. Then 2 more properties. Then a commercial building on Queen Street East. Then a partnership in a mixed-use development in Corktown that had appreciated so dramatically it made the early investments look like pocket change. I lived the way I always had, because I had no reason to live differently. The truck worked. The house was paid for. I had my tools, my property in Muskoka, my season tickets to the Leafs. Money had never been the point. The point was the work. The point was building things that lasted. My son had no idea. The Hazelton Hotel dinner had been arranged by her family, and when my son mentioned the venue to me over the phone, I went quiet for a moment that he misread as simple surprise. What I was actually doing was calculating. Because the Hazelton sits on a parcel of Yorkville real estate in which the Carter Holdings Trust is a 40% stakeholder through a numbered corporation that has no public-facing connection to my name. I had been a passive investor in the property group for 11 years. The general manager knew me. The front desk staff did not. I called David the following morning. "I need to understand the structure of our position in the Hazelton partnership," I said. He walked me through it. 40% equity stake. Full investor rights, including the right to review and approve major event contracts above a certain threshold. The dinner had been booked under her family's name and had cost, according to David's inquiry, $14,000 for the private dining room, the custom menu, and the service team. I asked David if our partnership stake entitled us to a named representative at all events held in the private dining facilities. He said yes. I asked him to put that in writing. Then I drove to Toronto in the snowstorm and walked into the lobby and handed over my coat and waited while a young woman with a practiced smile checked an iPad and went to find someone in a fitted black suit. Now I was sitting in the parking garage at 7:43 in the evening, the engine running, snow falling outside on Hazelton Avenue. I'd told David to wait for my call. He had the documents ready. All that remained was for me to make the decision. I thought about my son upstairs. I thought about him at the table with her family, performing the version of himself that she had been slowly constructing over the past 18 months. I thought about the pause before he said yes to Christmas. I thought about the words he was using that weren't his words. I thought about the night his mother died, and how he'd driven himself to the hospital because I was already there, and how when he walked through the door of her room he was still wearing his work clothes, and there was drywall dust on his collar, and how she'd looked at him and smiled the way she always smiled at him, like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life. I called David. "Do it," I said. What happened in the next 40 minutes, David told me about later. He contacted the Hazelton's general manager directly, invoking the investor representative clause. The funding arrangement for the evening's event, which had been partially underwritten through a hospitality credit line extended by the partnership, was revoked. The catering invoice was flagged as disputed. The general manager, a man named Francois who had been with the hotel for 14 years and who understood immediately what was happening, moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who has managed crises before. The power did not go out. This was not a dramatic film. What happened was that Francois walked into the private dining room at 8:15, excused himself for interrupting, and explained in the careful language of a professional that there was an administrative matter that required immediate attention. The credit line associated with the event had been flagged, and until it was resolved, the hotel was unable to continue service. "My son called me at 8:22, I answered. "Dad," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man standing in a hallway trying to sound calm. "What is going on?" "The hotel is saying there's a problem with the payment. Her father is asking questions. There are people here. Did you do something?" "I did," I said. "Why?" He sounded genuinely confused, not yet angry. "I was turned away at the door," I said. "My name wasn't on the list." Silence. A long silence. "Dad," he said finally, his voice lower. "I can explain that. I'd like to hear it." Another silence. I could hear voices in the background. Her father's voice, asking a question. Her voice sharp and controlled, answering it. "She thought it would be better," my son said, "given the dynamic. She said her parents have a very specific idea of how these introductions should go, and she was worried that you'd feel uncomfortable, and she thought it would be easier if we did the formal introduction another time, somewhere more casual." "She was worried I'd feel uncomfortable," I said. "Dad, I want you to tell me something," I said. "Did you agree to this? Did you tell them not to put my name on the list?" The silence this time was the longest one yet. "I should have called you," he said. "I should have told you." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I drove north on Avenue Road, and then west on Eglinton, taking the long way home through the city I'd invested in quietly for 15 years. My hands were steady on the wheel. The snow had eased to a light dusting. I passed a Tim Hortons on Lawrence where my son and I used to stop after his hockey games when he was 12, both of us still in our winter gear, him with his bag over one shoulder, ordering a hot chocolate and a Boston cream donut without looking at the menu because he always ordered the same thing. I drove for a long time before going back to the hotel. What I found when I returned was not chaos. It was the particular discomfort of wealthy people being told no, which is a different kind of scene altogether. Her parents were in the lobby with their coats on, speaking in low, urgent tones to Francois, who was listening with the expression of a man who has heard everything and is moved by none of it. Her father, who I was meeting for the first time, was a tall man with the posture of someone who had been right about things for a very long time. He was explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that the account was perfectly solvent, that he would like to speak with someone in management. Francois nodded. He was waiting for me. I walked in. My son saw me first. He was standing near the entrance to the dining room, his jacket off, looking like a man who had been having a very bad 30 minutes. When he saw me, something passed across his face that I couldn't fully read. Her parents turned when they noticed my son's expression. Francois stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," he said, "thank you for coming in. This is, as I mentioned, the representative stakeholder in the property trust. Her father looked at me. He looked at my truck through the lobby windows. He looked at my shirt. "You're the stakeholder," he said. 40%, I said. He looked at my son. My son looked at the floor. What happened after that was not a confrontation, because I didn't come for a confrontation. I came to do what should have been done at the beginning, which was to be in the room. Francois walked everyone to a sitting area near the fireplace and brought coffee, and I sat across from her parents and I explained, briefly and without drama, that I was a passive investor in the property group that partially owned the hotel, that I had held that position for 11 years, and that the administrative issue with the evening's event had arisen because the investor representative clause had been invoked in response to a breach of the courtesy protocols associated with hosted events. Her mother asked what that meant, practically speaking. "It means," I said, "that the cost of this evening's dinner has been redirected to an outstanding receivable within the partnership. In practical terms, the hotel will need alternate payment arrangements for the balance of the event before service can resume." "How much," her father said, "is the balance?" $14,200, Francois said. Her father's posture changed. Not dramatically, but I'd been watching people for 67 years, and I saw it. His investment portfolio, I learned over the following weeks through the simple process of asking David to look into it, was not what it had been represented to be. Forest Hill House, yes. Foundations, yes. But the money was tied up in structures that looked solid from the outside, and were significantly more fragile underneath. Not dishonest, exactly. Just the particular financial architecture of people who had been living at the level of their aspirations rather than their assets for a decade or so, and had gotten skilled at maintaining the appearance. "Her fiancé's family is leveraged," David told me, in the tone of a man who has seen this before. "They're not broke, but they're not what your son thinks they are." That was the discovery that shifted everything. Not for me. For my son. He called me the following morning from outside. I could tell by the traffic sounds, standing on a sidewalk somewhere in the city. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I said I would. "How much money do you actually have?" I was quiet for a moment. "Enough," I said. "Dad." "I own 4 commercial properties in Toronto," I said. "A building on Queen East, 2 mixed-use units in Corktown, a retail strip on the Danforth. I have a 40% stake in the Hazelton Partnership and minority positions in 2 other hospitality properties. I have a fully paid property in Muskoka and the house in Sudbury that is also paid for. My RRSP and investment accounts are managed by David and have been growing without interruption for 20 years. His breathing changed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked," I said. "And because I wanted you to build your own life. I didn't want you looking at what I had and measuring yourself against it. I wanted you to be proud of what you built. And you should be. You did build something. You built it yourself." The silence on the line was different this time. It wasn't the silence of a man caught in something. It was the silence of a man recalibrating. "She told me," he said quietly, "that you were limited, that you would hold me back. That the life we grew up in was something to move past, I know. She said you wouldn't fit with her family. She said you'd embarrass me. I drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to meet her family," I said. "I wore my good shirt. I ironed it myself." He didn't say anything for a long time. The engagement didn't end that week. I want to be honest about that, because the truth is rarely as clean as we'd like it to be. My son was in love, or something that he understood as love, and disentangling that from the other things, the status, the approval, the vision, takes time. He didn't call off the engagement in a dramatic gesture. What happened was slower and more like the way a foundation settles, gradually and then all at once. He started asking questions. Not the questions she wanted him to ask, which were about venues and guest lists and family financial arrangements. The other questions. The questions that come when a man begins to look at the structure of his life and wonder which parts are load-bearing. He found out about her family's finances through his own work in commercial real estate. He had access to the kind of databases that showed him things that weren't visible from the outside. He called me one evening and read me a list of numbers in a flat voice, and I listened without comment until he was done. She knew, he said. She knew what her family's position actually was. She told me they had generational wealth. She told me her father had liquidity that other people in their circle could only imagine. She said all of this while knowing that half the Forest Hill house was a home equity line of credit. I didn't say I told you so. It's not a thing I believe in. What he needed then wasn't my anger. He needed my steadiness. He needed to know that the ground beneath him was still solid, even though the structure he'd been building on top of it had turned out to be something other than what he was told. He ended the engagement in March. He did it privately, and with respect, which I was proud of. He moved out of the Liberty Village condo, which had been in her name, and took a furnished apartment in the East End while he figured out next steps. He called me every Sunday again. The calls were longer than they'd been in years. In April, he drove up to Sudbury for a weekend. We went out to the property in Muskoka, broke the ice on the dock, sat in the truck with the heater running and thermoses of coffee, looking at the lake the way we used to when he was a teenager, and we didn't need to fill the silence with anything. I was wrong about a lot of things, he said. You were in it, I said. It's hard to see clearly when you're in the middle of something. I should have called you in, he said, when she said to keep you out. I should have said no right then. Yes, I said. You should have. He nodded. He looked at the lake. I'm sorry, Dad, he said. And he meant it in the way that people mean things when they've actually thought about them. I know you are, I said. We sat there for a while. A Canada goose crossed the open patch of water near the far shore. The pines on the north side were still carrying some snow, bent slightly under the weight of it. I want to understand what you actually built, my son said finally. The properties, the trust. I want to understand it. I told him that was a conversation for another day, but that when he was ready, I'd walk him through all of it. He looked at me. There was something in his face that reminded me of the way he used to look at blueprints when he was a boy, the particular focus of someone trying to understand how something was made. I want to learn, he said. I know, I said. That's where it starts. In June, he came with me to a walkthrough at the Corktown building. We went floor by floor, and I showed him how to look at a property, not the cosmetics but the bones, the load-bearing walls, the electrical panels, the places where moisture gets in if you don't stay ahead of it. He took notes in a small notebook and asked good questions, the kind that come from someone who is trying to understand rather than trying to impress. Afterward, we went to a diner on King Street and he bought me a coffee and we sat at a table by the window watching the streetcars go by. You know, he said, I always thought the truck was because you couldn't afford anything else. It works, I said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in a while. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me, that you wanted me to build my own life, that you didn't want me measuring myself against what you had. I nodded. I think I went wrong somewhere in the middle of that, he said. I started measuring myself against something else instead, something that turned out to not even be real. Most things that look like status aren't, I said. The ones that actually have it don't need to show you. He was quiet, thinking about that. She used to say you were out of your depth, he said. She used to say that without any money or connections, you'd never understand the world she grew up in. I understand property values, I said. I understand debt-to-equity ratios. I understand what a home equity line of credit looks like when it's dressed up as generational wealth. I understand all of it just fine. He looked at me. You knew, he said. I had a good sense of it, I said. Why didn't you say anything? Because you needed to find out yourself, I said. If I'd told you, you'd have thought I was jealous. You'd have thought I was trying to hold you back the way she told you I would. You weren't ready to hear it from me. You had to see it yourself. He nodded slowly. It was the hardest thing. It was the hardest thing I've done in a long time, I said. And I've done some hard things. We drove back up to Sudbury that evening, him following in his car, me in the truck. I watched his headlights in the rearview mirror the whole way up. Highway 400, steady and close. By the time we got to the house, it was nearly midnight. The sky was clear the way it only gets up north. More stars than you could count. He stayed the weekend. We did a repair on the south fence on Saturday morning, the two of us working without talking much, and it felt like the old way of being together that we'd lost somewhere in the past 2 years. He made dinner Saturday night, something his mother used to make, a Portuguese chicken stew he'd learned from her recipe cards. We ate at the kitchen table with the radio on low. Sunday morning, I showed him the filing cabinet in the study where I kept the trust documents. Not all of it, not in detail, just enough for him to understand the scope of what I'd built and how long it had taken and what it had actually looked like from the inside, which was mostly just work, one decision after another over 40 years, each one made on the same simple principle: build something that lasts. He stood at the filing cabinet for a long time, turning pages, not saying anything. "All of this," he said finally. I nodded. "And you never said a word." "The truck works," I said. "The house is paid for. I have what I need." He put the documents back carefully, the way you handle something that has taken a long time to make. He closed the cabinet. He stood there with his hand on it for a moment. "I want to be the kind of man you respect," he said. "Not because of what I inherit, because of what I build." "I know," I said. "You already are. You just got turned around for a while. It happens." He came around the desk and he put his arms around me the way he used to when he was small, and I held on for a moment, and then we both let go and went back to being men who don't make a production of things. He drove back to Toronto on Sunday afternoon. Before he left, he stood by his car in the driveway and looked at the house, the garden along the south wall just starting to come up the way it always did. And he said, "She's still there." "She never needed much," I said. He nodded. He got in his car and drove out to the road and turned south toward the city. I watched until his car disappeared around the bend, and then I went back inside. The sign had never been at my door. It had never been at my gate. But I understood now what my son had let someone else put in his heart, an idea that the man who raised him wasn't enough, wasn't the right kind, wasn't worth the room. That idea was gone now. And the work of being his father, the real work, not the writing of checks or the managing of trust documents, but the standing steady while someone you love finds their way back to who they are. That work was something I'd been doing for 34 years, and I intended to keep doing it for as long as I had. The garden came up along the south wall. The truck ran. The lake was quiet. It was enough.